Hi, everybody. It's so nice that you're all here. Wow, so many people. A little intimidated, but I'll do the best I can. So, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Horned God. I just wrote a book called The Horned God of the Witches. You can see how informative it is by all of these lack of words. I actually lost my copy and sold all the ones that I had gotten from Llewellyn, which is really nice. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this. I have a little slideshow, and hopefully I think you can see that. We'll just go to enter full screen. And yeah, so this is the cover art to The Horned God of the Witches. This by Laura Tempest Zakroff, who's great. Most of you know Laura. Anyway, my first book, the first time I ever tried to write a book, it was a Horned God book. And I sent it to Llewellyn in 2005. They promptly rejected it, which they should have, because it was really terrible. I wasn't a particularly good writer back then. Grown, changed. But once they rejected it, I kind of published it a little bit on my own. But 7 or 8 years ago, I decided I'm going to retire it. I'm never going to let anybody see it. And I'm never going to write a Horned God book in my entire life. That's a part of me that's done. It's just not going to happen. And then one day, it's, I think, late November of 2018, or perhaps the first week of December in 2018, I'm in my shower, and all of a sudden I start having these ideas. Like, if I did this and this and this and this, I could write a Horned God book, and it would kind of show everything that I think is important in a Horned God book. And so I ran out of the shower, dripping wet, sat down, wrote this outline out, talked to my editor, and then she proceeded to let me write this book. One of the things that I wanted to do while I was writing The Horned God of the Witches was approach everything fresh. So I have been researching, writing, doing workshops and rituals all about the Horned God for more than 20 years. And sometimes when you do things for that long, you get certain ideas in your head that maybe are wrong, or you repeat something that you picked up that maybe isn't quite right. Also, I think that you just simply become a better person as you get older sometimes. It's not true for everybody, but hopefully I think for me it was the case. And you see things in a different way because you learn and you grow and you change. And I wanted to put some of my own growth into the Horned God. And luckily for me, so many of the things that I was reading the second time around were really suggestive of that own growth in my own life, and that sort of growth I think that we've had in witchcraft and pagan communities, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. I grew up as a Wiccan witch. I've been doing that for over 20 years. And if you're familiar with Wiccan witchcraft at all, it's often accused of being way too binary. Male, female. We call to the god and goddess. We call to the lord and lady. And there's never anything mentioned in between. I knew early on in my witchcraft experiences that wasn't right. I mean, there has to be a god like coupling with other gods and goddesses coupling with other goddesses. And there have to be deities who have no gender at all or who don't identify as male or female, because we see that in our society. And to me, the gods represent all of us. And that when we're in circle, we should be able to see some aspect of ourselves with what's being presented. I know, especially in a lot of books in the 80s and 90s, you always hear the story of the Wheel of the Year with the young maiden goddess and the young horned god, and they hook up at Beltane, and then the god dies in the autumn time at Lammas or Samhain or the autumn equinox or something, and then she gives birth to him at Yule, and the process starts over and over again. And it's not the worst story in the world, but it doesn't represent everybody. It certainly doesn't represent a lot of deities from antiquity, and it certainly doesn't illustrate or highlight everybody that I circle with. So it's really important that the deities that I honor, the people that I circle with, can see themselves reflected in those deities. So one of the great things about sitting down and writing The Horned God of the Witches and doing all of this new research and taking notes and finding things out was there's a lot more to it than just the Horned God. And when we think of the Horned God, the things that we think of are usually antlers or horns, which some people are like, Jason, those are two very different things. and they are, but we usually just kind of use the term horn god. So you think of things on top of somebody's head, and then the thing that you think of the most after that tends to be an erect penis, a phallus. And, gods like Pan were depicted like that in the ancient world. Sometimes, too, people will depict gods that weren't depicted that way in the ancient world with such attributes. Most famously, Kronos, who was never pictured in any sort of phallic way. Every great once in a while, you'll see like a drawing and, his penis will be out. And in antiquity, Kronos always wore pants and never took them off. So those are the things we think of with the horned god, maybe also two wild spaces in the earth, but we think of those physical characteristics, and then we associate those physical characteristics with men and males. And that's not always how it was in the ancient world. So this is the Pashupati seal, which is found in the Indus River Valley civilization, which is kind of like in Pakistan today. It's often linked to the god Shiva. There are a lot of scholars who think that this is a female figure. And when you see it in witchcraft books, it's often in conjunction with Kronos, because Kronos is often depicted in a sitting posture. And this figure, too, is in a sitting posture. But you see very clearly on top of the head, there's either horns on the head or horns coming out of a horned hat or headdress. There are also 3 different faces on this figure, which often gets lost. The seal itself is very, very tiny, but somebody put a lot of work into making it, and it's pretty ambiguous. And I think if you look at the chest, maybe you could see breasts there. Maybe it is a female figure. This is a 4,100-year-old figure. If it is female, it's certainly not what we usually associate with the horned god when we hear that term. So to me, it's pretty interesting. But this symbol is just one of several different horned or antlered goddesses in the ancient world. The most famous of those is the Egyptian Hathor. You can see her there on the left in the middle. She has cow horns coming out of her head. And then on the picture on the left, you see her with her face as a cow. Now, I will say that if I went up to my wife and depicted her with cow horns or with the face of a cow, I would be sleeping on the couch for the next 8 weeks. And that is probably giving myself too much credit. But in the ancient world, being associated with cows or cattle was a symbol of wealth and power and influence. It was not something that was derogatory. It was something that was very, very complimentary. The goddess Hera, for instance, in the Iliad, is depicted as called sow-eyed, ox-eyed, or cow-faced, depending on the translator. And that was because cows and oxes were animals that were very important, and they were honored, and people respected them, and to be associated with them says something about your power. If you know anything about Hera, you don't get away with things with Hera. She could be pretty vengeful. So the fact that we're still talking about Homer all these thousands of years later, and he either called her cow-faced, sow-eyed, or ox-eyed, says that she must have approved of that. Cows, bulls, very important horned animals. There were a lot of different sort of bull gods in the ancient world. To me, one of the most famous, and sometimes this gets lost when people think about this particular deity, is Dionysus, who often took the form of a bull. This is Ari, the woman who would make me sleep on the couch for 8 weeks at a minimum if I did the wrong thing. Here we are with Dionysus. This was just last week, and I think it was Dionysus winking at me to get ready for this presentation. If you see the picture on the right, especially, or yeah, you're right, you'll see that Dionysus appears to have breasts. Dionysus is often called gender fluid, and I think it is the correct terminology for Dionysus. In the ancient world, Dionysus often presented with very feminine traits. A lot of his male followers did the same. And there are kind of images in the ancient world of Dionysus that are really ambiguous when it comes to male, female types of things. And I just want to throw out there, why does a deity have to have an assigned gender role? They're deities. Were here before us, long before us. They'll be here long after us. I don't think they act exactly like people. If a deity wants to be female for a while, if a deity wants to be non-binary for a little while, and if a deity wants to be male for a little while, I think that's all good. I will not talk about last night's episode of Loki on Disney Plus, but look at some Loki mythology to see what I'm talking about here. But yeah, Dionysus, gender fluid, a great place to start before moving to this other Greek god. This is Pan. This is with a goat. Hopefully it's consensual with the goat. The goat does have its tongue out. It seems to be enjoying itself. And this is probably what we think of when we think of a Greek horned god. We think of Pan. We think of the phallus because it's often depicted on Pan. However, there are alternative versions of Pan out there in the ancient world, and several of them depict a female Pan. What does this mean exactly? No one is exactly sure what it means or how it should be interpreted. However, I will tell you that a lot of our ideas about the gods are wrong. So when we're young, we sit down and we read something like Bulfinch's mythology, which gives us a pretty clear picture of the gods and who their parents are and how everything kind of came to be. And the story seems very coherent. In reality, the Greek gods, there were dozens of different versions of the same god, depending on the city and the place that you were at. The gods could vary quite a bit, and how they were drawn or how they were sculpted or chiseled also varied quite a bit from place to place. Features would change. Usually, gender wasn't something that would change, but here in these images of Pan, that seems to be exactly what it was. Sometimes a god would be presented in triplicate. There's a great picture of Aphrodite where there are 7 Aphrodites to represent 7 different functions of Aphrodite. So the gods could be depicted in a multitude of different ways. And just because we're used to seeing Pan with goats doesn't necessarily mean that was the only way that Pan was depicted, as these 2 images clearly show. Are there a lot of these kind of images in the ancient world? No, there aren't dozens and dozens of them, but there are some, which means that Pan was whispering or playing the flute in the ear of somebody who was doing these, and Pan wanted to be presented a certain way, which was a little different from how they were normally presented. One of the things about a god like Pan, when I say that they could be done in different ways in art, I'm not kidding. That image on the left looks to me like Pan as the Stoic philosopher. Brings me great joy every time I see it, but it's not the typical image of Pan, because there's not just one typical image of Pan. There are dozens of images of Pan. There aren't quite dozens and dozens and dozens of images of this particular deity. This is Kronos. We tend to think of Kronos today as a Celtic deity. However, he really wasn't like a pan-Celtic deity. Most of his worship was limited to a specific place, and that was around modern-day Paris. Back then, we called France Gaul, and that's where Kronos was primarily worshipped, was Gaul. There are about 40 or 50 images that we can say with some definity are Kronos. We know that they're Kronos because they look very much like this. Kronos is usually depicted in a certain way, and the Gundestrup cauldron, which is one of those more far-field artifacts made in Thrace, found in a peat bog in Denmark. The cauldron itself actually has elephants on it and a bunch of deities that have never been identified, so it's a very complex piece of art. Anyway, they usually kind of look like this. However, in that area around Paris, there are also these little statues. Again, there aren't dozens and dozens of them, but there are enough that it makes you think about what they might mean and what they are. So, is this a female version of Kronos? It's hard to say. If you look at the figure on the left, though, you definitely see the sitting posture that we associate the most with Kronos. It also looks like a lamp that would receive offerings. And both figures have things in their hands that suggest offerings or gifts. Kronos is generally depicted with things that have to do with wealth, like the torque, and there are other images of Kronos where they appear with coins. So having things is very much in line with Kronos. And I'm sorry that I'm coughing a little bit. Did workshops yesterday too, so my voice is a little fried. I love the juxtaposition of these 2 images. Are they related? Maybe the figure on the right is Kronos' wife, daughter, something else. Maybe it's Kronos themselves. It's hard to say, But it just goes to show you that there were antlered and horned deities in the ancient world, worshipped in proximity to deities that we know like Carnonos as well. This is Ellen of the Ways. Today, when I think of an antlered or horned goddess, this is the first thing that pops into my head. If you've never heard of Ellen of the Ways, I'm going to give you a little mini course on Ellen. Ellen is the British goddess of the natural world, fertility, gardens, underground sources of water, ley lines, roads, migratory routes, and reindeer. That last is especially important because reindeer are the one animal with antlers where women reindeer also have the antlers. So for a female to have antlers is pretty rare. Reindeer females have antlers. So Ellen as a goddess, if she was going to have antlers, they would be that of a reindeer. Ellen is what I would call a revealed goddess. You're not going to find an ancient Ellen of the Ways story because they don't really exist. In the mid-'80s, a feminist and goddess scholar named Caroline Wise, she started to read between the lines, and she believed that there was an ancient reindeer goddess that was probably worshipped in Britain. A lot of the reasoning for that comes from the Mabinogian, or the Mabinogi, as one of my British friends makes sure that I call it. And in that particular story, there's several stories. One of them, and this one has Ellen or Helen, as she's sometimes called. There's a story of the Emperor Maximus. He has a dream about a beautiful woman. He sends people around the earth to find the beautiful woman. Of course, the beautiful woman is Ellen or Helen. He goes to her. They get married. She tells him to build some roads. So there's some strife that breaks out. There's some battles. He wins the battles because of the roads, because it allowed him to move his troops quickly. And then her father is given dominion over Britain and Gaul. And later, Ellen is recognized as a saint of Wales, though not officially by the Catholic Church. And she's credited with starting Christian churches. The Mabinogian, though, is a unique tale in that while it has lots of human characters, many people believe that those characters are also old references to deities. So instead of just being a person, perhaps she's a goddess and her story kind of got transformed. There's another interesting piece of evidence for this because there's an old Roman road that predates Maximus named the Sarn Helen, and that is in Britain. And that road has to be named after somebody. So why not Ellen of the Ways? Why not Ellen as a reindeer goddess? You know, there are a lot of people who sort of scoff at the Ellen stuff. I remember when I started the book, I knew I was going to put Ellen in the book. I wasn't exactly sure how I felt about it because this is a goddess without a myth, so to speak. There aren't stories that say Ellen of the Ways. There's not a lot of archaeological evidence, unless, of course, you think that this could perhaps be Ellen of the Ways, and perhaps it very well could. But then I began to think about other things. And if you go on Amazon today and you search Ellen of the Ways, you'll find statues made by a giant statue company that mass produces these statues, and they have to be being sold to somebody. You'll find books about Ellen. You'll find t-shirts with Ellen on them. A lot of people talk about agency of the gods, and then they mock people if they worship a god that they think is new or is not supported by history. I don't care if there are 2,000-year-old stories about a deity or not. The fact that there is this statue here, the fact that there are these books, the fact that there are these t-shirts, the fact that when I go on the road and talk to people, people talk to me about Ellen, the fact that people in my own coven talk to me about Ellen sometimes, that to me is all the proof that I need that that goddess is real. And why is that goddess real? That goddess is real so that there are other ways to come into the mysteries of the Horned One. What are those mysteries? They can vary from person to person. Maybe it's the mysteries of the wild spaces. Maybe it's the mystery of getting in touch with your own sexuality, whatever that is. But Ellen is another pathway to the Horned One. And I think a very valid representation of what we generally call the Horned God. But more and more, I just keep calling the Horned One because I like taking the gender away from it. One other deity that's worth speaking of, this is Baphomet. This is an image that has been really misappropriated by Christians the last 150, 180 years. Baphomet really just represents everything or all, which is why Baphomet has female and male characteristics. The story of Baphomet is a little involved, so I won't get into it here. But people use this image to frighten others, and it shouldn't frighten anybody. The older I get, the more I love this particular image. In the 19th century, Pan began to be used in new ways in literature, and I won't get into this very much because these presentations are supposed to only be 20 minutes, and we're at 19. But in poetry, Pan became the liberator of repressed or forbidden sexualities, meaning that Pan spoke to a wide range of people. He spoke to a lot of women, and the female libido was something that was repressed for a very, very long time. It was thought that women didn't like sex, didn't enjoy sex, and shouldn't be sexual creatures. People would write poems about Pan to represent that. And then, of course, Pan and gay sexuality goes back all the way to the ancient world. I love Victor Newberg's The Triumph of Pan, the odor of thy hair, thy feet, thy hand shall bring again the pagan spring, and from our body's union men shall know to cast the veil from the sad face of woe. But Pan, 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 and all the world shall be mingled in one burning ecstasy. So there are various different ways to interpret the Horned One, and I think that it's more than a lot of people tend to think. And I think it's worth talking about these little things. So I'm going to take some questions now and turn off my screen. You can see me not saving everything. Hopefully I can see the chat and read your questions. Not being particularly useful. Hi. Trying to find the chat, and then okay. Thank you, Jason. Thank you. I don't know. My computer just sort of froze up, and it's really kind of annoying. So the next 7 minutes, I'll look at questions and things. Thankfully, I have my phone here, so that worked out pretty well. So one of the questions is, how long have you been researching Pan/Ellen, etc.? I would say that I've probably been researching them since 1997, 1998, when I first got interested in witchcraft. What I was interested in the most was goddess worship specifically, and then that began to change a little bit, and I felt the call of the Horned One, most specifically first Pan. And when I feel called for something, it makes me really want to get like super involved and find out everything that I can about these deities. And I began researching horned gods. Over the years, my ideas about the Horned One has changed quite a bit. This workshop is definitely an example of that. I first heard of Helen probably in 2015, 2016, and then my interest really picked up in 2018. I think I was at Pagan Spirit Gathering, and there were people there with Ellen shirts, and they were selling Ellen statues with one of the vendors. So I really kind of wanted to get into that. And one of the great things about Caroline Weiss and her stories of Ellen is she's been really upfront about her research process when she was like learning about Ellen. Another question is from Kathy. Are there any good sources for info on Ellen other than Ellen Sentier and Caroline Weiss? Not really. There's not. And part of that is because, they're some of the first people to write about Ellen. However, I think on social media, you find people talking more and more about Ellen of the Ways. And I think that's really where a lot of it's going to come from. It's going to be people looking into the stories and the myth and their interactions with her, and then sharing that information. Lorraine asks, how best to use the horned god / goddess? I really like that in solitary practice. I don't really think that there's any one particular way. I mean, I think the best way to build a relationship with deity is usually through libations, give to the gods so that they might give also to you. I know that in my own personal work, when I need to connect with the earth, when I feel disconnected from being outside, that happened a lot here in California last year with the wildfires when they said don't go outside because you can't breathe the air. And it was also COVID, so you couldn't go outside for that. Doing things on my horned god altar connected me back to outside, this place that I really wasn't allowed to go to for the first time in my life. Work with them, find out, what parts of them speak to you, and then incorporate them into your practice. You all are very nice with the thank yous. I really appreciate it. Let's see, what other questions? Yes, Nancy writes, Baphomet was linked to the Inquisition of the Knights Templar. Very, very true. One of the things about Baphomet is really originally a Baphomet was a head, and it was thought that the Knights Templar were worshiping a head, and people thought it was the head of Muhammad. And Baphomet is actually a corruption of Muhammad. Jericho asks, in your opinion, could the mythos of the Horned One be similar to the Pan-American, Native American mythos of the trickster? Possibly. Certainly, there's some overlap. Pan, when he was thinking with his big head, could sometimes be a trickster. The kind of Native American deity or Kachina that I see the most, that has the most in common with the horned god, is probably the figure that we call Kokopelli today, who the Hopi would have called Kukupolo. And there's a lot of information on that. I didn't write about it in the book because I felt like it was getting into issues of a cultural appropriation and stuff. However, there's a blog article that I have up. If you just type Jason Mankey Kokopelli, you could read that. And there are also resources in the bibliography of the Horned God book. What else do we have? Jason, from Jason. So do you think of the Horned One as a combination of these deities, or are they ways to understand parts of him? I would probably argue that the Horned God, as we think of the Horned God today, is made up of lots of different parts, probably so that there are various ways to get to know this deity. You can enter through Chronos, or you can enter through Ellen. Certainly, there's been a lot of literature the last 150 years that have influenced how we see the Horned God and kind of changed how we see the Horned God. I cover a lot of that in the book. It's always weird when you write about history because you don't want to necessarily write about it in a way that makes people think you're a non-believer. And I'm certainly a believer in the greater Horned God kind of archetype construct, and certainly individual horned gods. Esther writes, do you have any tips for genderqueer or gender fluid people who are interested in seeking traditions that appear to emphasize a gender binary and fertility, such as Gardnerian Wicca? Yes, I think that I do have some tips. There are a lot of Gardnerians who are much more open about things than many Gardnerians were 30 or 40 years ago. And there are a lot of us in the Gardnerian tradition who want genderqueer and gender fluid people in our covens, and we'll certainly have space for those individuals in our coven. So if you're looking into those traditions, just ask questions of the people who are running them and make sure that they're inclusive as possible. Ask as many questions as you can. If you don't get straight answers, I probably wouldn't join that coven. Obviously, in an initiatory tradition, there are certain things that we can and can't say. However, I will also say that if you have questions about where you belong, I'm going to answer those questions, and you'll feel like you belong within our coven. Sasha says, love hearing what you have to say. Thank you for that. I am on Instagram. I'm on Instagram as Pan Mankey. That's my last name, Mankey, with God Pan in front of it. I'm also on Facebook, and you can send me email at panmankey@gmail.com. Let's see. I love the presentation. Thank you so much. Is there any suggestions for are beginners who are interested to work with deities. My favorite book for people who are interested in working with deities to start is probably John Beckett's Path of Paganism. John is a devotional polytheist. He really puts working with the gods at the forefront of his pagan practice, and his book has a lot of really great information into that topic. So, yeah. Again, it's 1:30, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for being really patient as I work through my difficulties with my computer. Thank you all for being here, and hopefully I'll run into all of you again down the road. So thank you.